Using the clarity and purpose that sobriety had brought him, Neil channeled his gratitude into action by establishing the 217 Foundation, named after the exact timestamp when Ozzy's message had arrived to save his life. The foundation's mission was comprehensive, providing treatment scholarships for musicians who couldn't afford rehabilitation, offering peer mentorship programs that paired established artists in recovery with those currently seeking help, and creating safe spaces where industry professionals could discuss addiction without fear of career consequences. The Foundation's peer mentorship program became particularly successful, directly modeled on the relationship that Ozzy had demonstrated in his final message to Neil, one of unconditional support, practical wisdom, and unwavering belief in the possibility of transformation. Ozzy used his final days to reach out and help people, Neil explained during the Foundation's launch event, his voice steady but emotional. The least I can do is use the days I've been given to do the same thing. If we can help even one person avoid the years of pain and destruction that addiction causes, then Ozzy's message will have accomplished something truly important. Neil's sobriety also allowed him to participate more fully in tributes and memorials for Ozzy following his death. At a major tribute concert held at the Hollywood Bowl 6 months after Ozzy's passing, Neil delivered what many critics would later describe as the finest vocal performance of his entire career. He performed a stunning, emotionally charged version of "Mama, I'm Coming Home" that he dedicated to Ozzy's memory and to everyone fighting their own battles with addiction. Before beginning the song, Neil addressed the massive audience with words that would be replayed countless times on social media and news programs. This song is for Ozzy, who saved my life with his final words. But it's also for anyone out there who's struggling and wondering if tomorrow can be different from today. Ozzy wanted me to tell you that it can be. It absolutely can be. The voice that sang these words understood pain, understood addiction, understood what it means to lose yourself and find your way back. If you're listening tonight and you're fighting that same battle, please know that you're not alone. The performance was transcendent, Neil's voice carrying new depths of emotion and technical precision that demonstrated how sobriety had restored not just his health, but his artistic abilities. The audience, which included surviving members of Black Sabbath, music industry legends, and thousands of fans, was visibly moved by the raw honesty and vocal mastery on display. The broader music industry's response to Neil's recovery and his openness about Ozzy's role in it helped shift conversations about addiction within the entertainment community. Rather than treating substance abuse as a moral failing or career-ending scandal, more artists began speaking openly about their struggles and seeking help when they needed it. Music industry veteran Danny Goldberg observed, "Vince's story, and particularly Ozzy's message to him, showed us that addiction doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of a new chapter, one that's potentially even more meaningful than what came before." The technological aspect of Ozzy's message, delivered via text rather than a letter or phone call, also spoke to how modern relationships maintain connection and provided support. The immediacy and intimacy of text communication allowed for a different kind of connection than traditional forms of correspondence. "There's something about receiving a text message that makes it feel immediate and personal," Neil observed during interviews. "When I saw Ozzy's name on my phone, even though he was thousands of miles away, it felt like he was right there with me in that moment. That immediacy made his words even more powerful." Years into his recovery journey, Neil began to understand that Ozzy's message had been about far more than just getting sober. It had been about reclaiming his identity, rebuilding his relationships, and finding new sources of meaning and purpose in his life. Sobriety wasn't the end goal. It was just the foundation for everything else that would follow. Ozzy's message helped me understand that getting clean was about creating the space for me to become the person I was always meant to be, Neil reflected during a documentary interview 3 years after receiving the text. All the creativity, all the passion, all the things that make performance meaningful, they were all still there. They just needed to be uncovered from under years of self-medication and destructive behavior. The legacy of Ozzy's final message continued to grow and influence people years after both the message was sent and Ozzy's death. Treatment centers began incorporating the story into their curriculum, using it to demonstrate how peer support and genuine care could be catalysts for transformation. Recovery coaches started referring to Ozzy moments, those crucial instances when someone receives exactly the support they need at exactly the right time. The concept became part of the lexicon of addiction recovery, representing the power of human connection to interrupt destructive patterns and inspire positive change. The story also became a powerful example of how legacy could be created through personal relationships rather than just professional achievements. While Ozzy would always be remembered primarily for his music and his influence on heavy metal, his final message to Vince Neil demonstrated that his greatest impact might have been on the individual lives he touched through simple acts of kindness and support. When people talk about Ozzy's legacy, Neil would often say in interviews, they focus on Black Sabbath, on his solo career, on his influence on music. All of that is important and deserves to be remembered. But for me, his greatest achievement was being the kind of friend who would use his final coherent moments to try to save someone else's life. That's the Ozzy I want people to remember, not just the wild man of rock, but the human being who understood that we're all in this together. The preservation of the message in digital format ensured that Neil would never lose those precious words, but more importantly, it allowed him to share them with the world when he felt ready. The actual text was eventually displayed as part of a museum exhibit about addiction and recovery in the music industry, with Neil's permission. Visitors would often be seen reading the words with tears in their eyes, moved by the raw honesty and love contained in Ozzy's final communication. As Neil's recovery strengthened and his new purpose became clearer, he began incorporating his story into his live performances, using his platform to reach people who might be struggling with similar battles. His concerts became part entertainment, part testimony, part call to action for anyone who needed help. The response was overwhelming. Fans began approaching him after shows to share their own stories of addiction and recovery, creating a community of support that extended far beyond the music itself. The last message that Ozzy Osbourne wrote to Vince Neil had indeed made him burst into tears as he said goodbye. But those tears weren't just about endings. They were about beginnings. Not just goodbye to Ozzy, but goodbye to the version of himself that had been slowly dying for years, making room for the person he was meant to become. In those tears was grief for time lost, gratitude for friendship offered, and hope for the possibility of redemption and renewal. The message became living proof that even in our darkest moments, we are not alone, that someone, somewhere, believes in our capacity for change, that it is never too late to choose a different path, and that sometimes the most powerful thing one person can do for another is simply to believe in their potential for transformation, even when they have lost the ability to believe in themselves. In sharing Ozzy's words with the world, Vince Neil ensured that his friend's final gift would continue to offer hope and healing to countless others who desperately needed to hear that they too were worth saving. The ripple effects of that 2:17 a.m. message continue to spread, touching lives and inspiring change in ways that neither Ozzy nor Neil could have imagined when those first words appeared on a phone screen in a Texas rehabilitation center. Sometimes the most important messages arrive at our darkest moments, reminding us that we are loved, that we have value, and that transformation is always possible when we have the courage to accept help and the determination to change. Ozzy's final text to Vince Neil stands as a testament to the power of friendship, the possibility of redemption, and the truth that no one has to face their demons alone. At 2:17 a.m. on July 18th, 2025, a single text message would rewrite the ending of one of rock's most tragic stories. The fluorescent lights in the Texas Rehabilitation Center cast harsh shadows across sterile walls as Vince Neil lay awake, staring at the ceiling tiles he'd memorized over the past 3 weeks. Sleep had become his enemy. Every time he closed his eyes, the demons danced. Regret, shame, the crushing weight of a life lived at maximum velocity finally hitting the wall. His phone buzzed against the nightstand, its blue glow cutting through the darkness. Another well-meaning friend checking in, he assumed. Another awkward conversation about getting better and taking it one day at a time. He almost let it go to voicemail, almost, but something made him reach for it. Maybe it was intuition, maybe it was desperation, maybe it was destiny. The sender's name made his heart stop. Ozzy Osbourne. At 76 years old, battling Parkinson's disease and facing his own mortality, the Prince of Darkness was typing in the early hours of the morning, his trembling fingers fighting against time and deteriorating motor skills. What followed would become the most precious gift Vince Neil would ever receive, and the last message Ozzy would ever send to anyone. The weight of that moment, unknown to Neil as he opened the message, would soon crush him with its significance. In 4 days, the voice that had screamed, "All aboard," and "Shot in the dark," would be silenced forever. But in this moment, in the quiet desperation of a rehabilitation center at 2:17 a.m., that voice was about to speak salvation into the darkness of Neil's soul. The phone felt heavy in Neil's hands as he prepared to read words that would change everything he thought he knew about friendship, addiction, redemption, and the power of one human being to save another across the vast distances of pain and time. The bond between these two metal legends wasn't built in boardrooms or award ceremonies. It wasn't forged through handshake deals or industry networking events. It was born in the fires of rock and roll excess during the legendary 1984 Bark at the Moon tour, a tour that would become infamous for all the wrong reasons, creating folklore that the music industry still whispers about 4 decades later. Picture 1984. MTV was reshaping music culture, hair metal was exploding into the mainstream, and 2 generations of metal royalty were about to collide on stages across America. Ozzy Osbourne, already a legend at 35, was riding high on his solo career success. Mötley Crüe, led by 23-year-old Vince Neil, was the hungry young pack ready to devour everything in their path. The combination was nuclear. Ozzy's established reputation for chaos met Mötley Crüe's youthful appetite for destruction, creating a perfect storm of debauchery that became the stuff of rock folklore. Hotels banned them, cities tried to cancel shows, insurance companies wept. But beneath all the headlines about property damage and backstage excess, something far more significant was happening. The 23-year-old Vince Neil was receiving an education that no music school could provide. He was learning survival from the undisputed master of chaos himself. While the press focused on the wild stories, the bat-biting, the public urination incidents, the constant stream of arrests and controversies, Neil was observing something entirely different. Ozzy took us under his wing, Neil would later reflect, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Yeah, we were all completely out of our minds most of the time, drunk and high and doing things that should have killed us. But Ozzy was also teaching us something crucial, how to survive in this business. He showed us that you could be absolutely wild on stage and still be professional about the music, that you could live the lifestyle and still respect the craft. The tour rolled through city after city, leaving a trail of legendary stories and deepening friendships. But one night in Detroit would change everything, creating a moment that would bind these two souls together for the next 4 decades. The Detroit show had been explosive, even by their impossible standards. Ozzy had commanded the stage like a possessed shaman, his voice cutting through the arena's roar with supernatural power. Mötley Crüe had opened with their usual blend of precision musicianship and controlled chaos. The crowd had been electric, feeding off the raw energy that only these 2 acts could generate together. After the final notes faded and the last roadie had begun breaking down equipment, the ritual after-party began. This wasn't just a celebration, it was an expected continuation of the show, where the real stories were written and the legends grew larger. Hotel suites filled with musicians, crew members, hangers-on, and an endless supply of substances that blurred the lines between celebration and self-destruction. But somewhere in the midst of this controlled chaos, Ozzy vanished. In a world where disappearing acts were common, where band members regularly went missing for hours only to resurface with new stories and fresh scars. This should have been nothing unusual. Yet something felt different that night. 23-year-old Vince Neil, despite his own indulgences, found himself searching. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was concern for someone he was beginning to see as more than just a tour headliner. Maybe it was the kind of intuition that kicks in when someone you care about is in real danger. He found Ozzy unconscious on the cold tile floor of a hotel bathroom, his skin pale as death, his lips tinged blue from oxygen deprivation. The scene was every rock star's nightmare made real. A near-fatal combination of alcohol and pills had pushed the Prince of Darkness to the very edge of the abyss he'd been dancing around for years. In that moment, Neil had a choice that would define both their futures. He could call security, which would bring management, probably media attention, and definitely consequences for everyone involved. Tours had been canceled for less. Careers had ended over similar incidents. The easy choice, the self-preserving choice, would have been to get help and let the industry machinery handle the crisis. Instead, Neil made a decision that probably saved Ozzy's life. He stayed. For hours, he sat on that bathroom floor, talking to Ozzy, keeping him conscious, monitoring his breathing, refusing to leave until he was certain his friend would survive. When medical help finally arrived, it came quietly, discreetly, without the fanfare and consequences that could have destroyed everything they'd worked for. No cameras captured the moment. No headlines screamed about the near-death experience. No industry executives learned about the liability they'd narrowly avoided. Just one human being choosing to save another without expectation of reward or recognition. 4 decades later, history repeats fast forward through 40 years of parallel careers, 40 years of similar struggles with the same demons that had nearly claimed Ozzy in that Detroit bathroom. By 2025, Vince Neil had become a living testament to both the heights rock stardom could reach and the depths to which it could drag a person. At 64, he had maintained his image as rock's eternal bad boy, someone who could handle anything and keep performing no matter what the cost. But the cost had been mounting for decades. The alcohol that had once fueled creativity and confidence had become a master rather than a servant. The lifestyle that had defined him for 4 decades was no longer just a choice, it had become a prison. Friends watched helplessly as Neil's drinking escalated from recreational to medicinal to desperate. Family members learned to expect broken promises and missed opportunities. Bandmates grew tired of covering for increasingly unreliable behavior. The controlled collapse, as those closest to him would later describe it, had been building for months. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment of rock bottom, no overdose or arrest that forced the issue. Instead, it was the slow, inexorable slide of someone whose body and spirit were simply giving up the fight. The intervention, when it finally came, was orchestrated by someone who understood the unique pressures and challenges of their shared world. Despite his own rapidly declining health, despite the tremendous effort that every conversation now required due to Parkinson's disease, Ozzy Osbourne made it his mission to save the friend who had once saved him. The phone call that convinced Neil to seek treatment had lasted over 2 hours. Ozzy, his speech slowed, but his determination unshakable, had shared stories about his own multiple attempts at sobriety, his relapses, his victories, and most importantly, his understanding that admitting you need help isn't weakness. It's the beginning of strength. Getting sober isn't about admitting you're weak, Ozzy had told him during that crucial conversation, each word carefully formed despite his condition. It's about admitting you're strong enough to change. I've been sober for long stretches over the years, and I've relapsed more times than I care to count. But every time I got back up, I got a little bit stronger. Every time I tried again, I learned something new about myself. Now lying in that Texas rehabilitation bed at 2:17 a.m., Neil was 3 weeks into what everyone hoped would be his successful journey toward recovery. But hope and reality were still at war in his mind. And on this particular night, at this particular moment, hope was losing. At 2:17 a.m., somewhere across the country in his Buckinghamshire home, Ozzy Osbourne sat hunched over his phone, fighting against trembling hands affected by Parkinson's disease to compose what he somehow knew would be his final message to anyone. Each letter was a small victory against his deteriorating motor skills, each word a battle against the fatigue that had become his constant companion. The message began simply, but with an intimacy that cut straight to the heart. Vince, I'm writing this at 3 o'clock in the morning because I can't sleep thinking about you. Sharon told me you finally went to that place in Texas. I'm so fucking proud of you, mate. I know how hard it is to admit you need help. It took me too many tries to get it right. As Neil read these opening words, something inside him began to break open. For weeks, he'd felt like a failure, like someone who had disappointed everyone who had ever believed in him. But here was Ozzy, the fucking Prince of Darkness himself, telling him he was proud. Not ashamed, not disappointed, proud. But this was just the beginning of what would become an emotional journey through shared history and mutual understanding that would leave Neil sobbing in his sterile rehabilitation room. The message continued with a revelation that shattered everything Neil thought he understood about their early relationship. I've been thinking about that night in Detroit, 1984. You remember when you found me in that hotel bathroom, completely gone, and you didn't call security or management? You just sat with me until I came down. You were just a kid then, barely 23. But you understood something that most people twice your age never figure out. You understood that addiction doesn't make someone a bad person, just a sick person who needs help. Neil's hands began to shake as he read these words. The Detroit incident had been something they'd never directly discussed, a shared trauma that had bonded them but remained unspoken. To see it acknowledged, to understand that Ozzy remembered not just the incident, but the compassion Neil had shown, was overwhelming. The message went deeper. You never asked for anything in return. You never used it against me. Never told a story to make yourself look good. You just helped because that's who you are. That night taught me something about real friendship, about the kind of loyalty that exists between people who understand each other's struggles. Tears began streaming down Neil's face as the full weight of Ozzy's gratitude hit him. For 40 years, he had carried that night as a burden, wondering if he'd done enough, fast enough, correctly enough. Now he was learning that his actions hadn't just helped Ozzy survive, they had taught him something fundamental about human connection. But Ozzy wasn't finished delivering revelations that would reshape Neil's understanding of their 4-decade friendship. The next section of the message contained something that would leave Neil completely broken. A confession that Ozzy had never shared with anyone, not even Sharon. There's something else I need to tell you, something I've never told anyone, not even Sharon. Do you remember the first night of that '84 tour in Portland? You were so nervous about opening for me that you were throwing up before the show. I remember standing at the side of the stage that night, watching you walk out there despite being terrified, and something hit me like a lightning bolt. Neil's memory raced back to that night. He could still feel the terror that had gripped him, opening for Ozzy fucking Osbourne, trying to prove that Mötley Crüe belonged on the same stage as a legend. The nausea had been so severe he'd barely made it through their set, convinced he was embarrassing himself in front of his hero. The message continued. I watched you grab that microphone and transform completely. All the nervousness vanished, and you became this force of nature, this perfect rock frontman. I thought to myself, this kid has something special. This kid might be better at this than I am. I'm not exaggerating, Vince. I saw your future that night, and it was brilliant. Neil had to put the phone down for a moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of this revelation. For 40 years, he had assumed that Ozzy barely noticed opening acts, that he was just another young singer trying to make it in a business full of dreamers. To learn that not only had Ozzy been paying attention, but that he had recognized something exceptional in Neil's performance was staggering. The validation was profound, but it was also complicated. If Ozzy had seen such potential in him all those years ago, what had gone wrong? How had that promising young performer become the broken man currently lying in a rehabilitation bed, fighting for his life against addiction? As if reading his thoughts, Ozzy's message addressed exactly that question. I know the industry has changed since we started. I know it's harder now to be authentic, harder to connect with people the way we used to. But your voice, your style, your approach to rock and roll, that's timeless. That doesn't get old or go out of fashion. The world still needs what you have to offer, but more importantly, you still need to offer it to the world. The message then shifted into even more personal territory, revealing the depth of Ozzy's understanding of what Neil was experiencing in treatment. I know you're scared right now. I know treatment feels like giving up, like admitting defeat, but I want you to think of it differently. Think of it as preparation for the next chapter. Think of it as getting ready for whatever comes after this. What followed was perhaps the most practical and heartfelt advice one human being had ever given another. Ozzy began sharing specific strategies that had helped him during his own multiple treatment experiences, wisdom earned through decades of falling down and getting back up again. "The hardest part for me was always the boredom," Ozzy wrote, and Neil could practically hear his friend's voice speaking the words. When you're used to living at maximum intensity all the time, normal life can feel incredibly dull. But that's where you learn to appreciate things you never noticed before. Conversations with people you care about, music that you're actually present to hear, sunsets that you're sober enough to really see. I know it sounds cheesy as fuck, but it's true. Neil found himself nodding in the darkness. The boredom was crushing. After decades of chemical enhancement, ordinary consciousness felt flat, colorless, insufficient. But here was Ozzy, who had lived the same lifestyle to even greater extremes, telling him that this too would pass. "The cravings will come in waves," the message continued. "Some days they'll hit you like a freight train, and you'll think you can't possibly survive without a drink. Other days you'll feel strong, like you've got this figured out. Both feelings are temporary. Both feelings are normal. The trick is to remember that you don't have to feel good to do the right thing. You just have to do the right thing, and eventually the good feelings will follow." The message also contained Ozzy's reflections on their shared history and the unique bond that had connected them across 4 decades of parallel careers. "We've seen a lot of people come and go in this business, Vince. We've outlasted trends and critics and record executives who thought we were finished. We've survived because we understand something that a lot of people don't. This isn't just a job for us. This is who we are. But being a rock star doesn't mean you have to destroy yourself in the process." As Neil continued reading, his tears intensified. The combination of Ozzy's evident concern, his practical wisdom, and his unwavering belief in Neil's potential was overwhelming. For months, Neil had felt isolated and hopeless, convinced that his best days were behind him and that his problems were too deep and complicated for anyone else to understand. But here was proof that someone did understand. Someone who had walked the same treacherous path, who had faced the same demons, who had survived to tell the tale and offer guidance to others still fighting the battle. Neil sat in his rehabilitation center bed, clutching his phone and crying harder than he had in decades. The message represented everything he had been desperately hoping to hear, but hadn't known how to ask for. Validation of his worth as an artist, acknowledgement of his struggles without judgment, practical advice from someone who had traveled the same treacherous path, and most importantly, unconditional love and support from someone he deeply respected and admired. When news of Ozzy's death reached Neil just 4 days later, the devastation was profound, but somehow also strengthening. Rather than viewing it as the loss of his support system, Neil chose to see it as a sacred responsibility. Ozzy had used some of his final energy, some of his last coherent moments, to try to save him. The least he could do was honor that gift by continuing to work toward recovery. "When I heard that Ozzy had died," Neil later explained to his counselors, "my first thought wasn't about losing a friend, though that pain was real and overwhelming. My first thought was that he had spent some of his last moments on Earth thinking about me and trying to help me. How could I possibly waste that? How could I not do everything in my power to make his final message to me meaningful?" The message became more than just words on a screen. It became Neil's North Star through the darkest days of recovery. Whenever he felt like giving up, whenever the cravings felt overwhelming, whenever he doubted whether he had the strength to continue, he would return to Ozzy's text, reading and rereading until he found the specific passage that spoke to whatever challenge he was facing. When he struggled with the daily routine of treatment, feeling like a prisoner in the structured environment, he remembered Ozzy's words about preparation for the next chapter. When he felt tempted to leave the facility early, convinced he could handle recovery on his own, he thought about his promise to stick with the program. When he worried that sobriety might somehow diminish his abilities as a performer, he focused on Ozzy's assurance that his talent had never been dependent on substances. The rehabilitation process that followed was still brutal. Recovery is never a straight line, and Neil faced setbacks, moments of crushing doubt, and times when the cravings felt like they might literally tear him apart from the inside. But whenever he reached those breaking points, Ozzy's message was there, offering strength and perspective from beyond the grave. The impact extended far beyond personal recovery. Neil's first post-rehab performance included a new song called 2:17 a.m., a direct tribute to the moment that changed his life. I woke up to salvation in a message on my phone, from a friend who knew the darkness, who had walked this path alone. The song became an anthem for recovery communities worldwide. Neil established the 217 Foundation, providing support for musicians struggling with addiction. The name honored not just the timestamp of Ozzy's message, but the moment when hope arrived in the darkness. Years later, when people ask Neil about the moment that changed his life, he always returns to that text message received at 2:17 a.m. in a Texas rehabilitation center. Ozzy's message saved my life, Neil always concludes. But more than that, it showed me that my life was worth saving. The last message Ozzy Osbourne wrote didn't just make Vince Neil burst into tears as he said goodbye. It made him burst into life as he said hello to the person he was always meant to become. In a world that often feels disconnected, Ozzy's final text proved that sometimes the most powerful thing one person can do for another is simply believe in their capacity for transformation. Sometimes that's all any of us really need. Someone who sees our potential even when we can't see it ourselves. The friendship that survived 4 decades of rock and roll chaos ultimately proved that love, expressed at exactly the right moment, can rewrite any ending, even our own.